There'll be full spoilers for Umurangi Generation in this video. I'll explain the game for those of you who insist on trudging onwards, but I seriously encourage you experience it yourself. Buy it, play it, support this brilliant piece of work and the incredible dev behind it. This is also going to be a pretty dark video, maybe my darkest so far. If you have a lot of anxiety about climate change or COVID-19, I suggest waiting until you feel in a right headspace. Umurangi Generation is the most bleak depiction of the hopelessness and sheer helplessness someone feels as they wander a world too big to handle, knowing that there's crisis and terror all around them, but being unable to do anything about them. It shows all of that complex emotion, that bleak helplessness, without dialogue, combat, or exposition. Just a lot of environmental detail and a few jellyfish monsters. Umurangi Generation takes place on the island of Aotearoa, which many of us are more familiar as the state of New Zealand. The game is steeped in Maori culture and thus uses Maori names in all of its levels and locations. There's countless examples of that culture being woven into the levels, graffiti of Maori cultural symbols, and references to attempts to revive ancient birds that went extinct due to colonialism and the subsequent poaching. It's an extremely angry game, one that can be genuinely unsettling to play if you're in a decent mood, because it never lets up. You play as a photographer with an old film camera, wandering around preset levels. Every picture you take is given a calculated value by the game based on interesting features and focus, with the missions being set to guide you towards specific goals you can accomplish in multiple ways. To find words, specific items, structures. This forces instantly a perceptiveness on you as you play. You're constantly looking, searching around for something, trying to find just the right thing to take in the most interesting and compelling manner possible. You climb up stairs, jump across balconies, all to get that perfect, wonderful shot of a skyline or a crate. You can edit the photos too, increasing contrast, lowering saturation, playing with the settings to make the photo truly, perfectly yours. The first level starts out easily enough. You're with a bunch of punks on the top of a roof, and you're taking pictures of the various graffiti and objects there, including a penguin. The next level puts you in the first seconds in front of a UN soldier with a gun. He makes no move towards you, no aggression. You can photograph him if you like. His inactivity reminds me of those guards outside Westminster Palace with the ridiculous hats. And then you keep searching for the mission items, and the world becomes a little clearer. A United Nations occupation met with petty resistance. Graffiti that reads something to the effect of, being property of the UN means promising you can work but always breaking down. The words property of the UN are a mission item. The game guided me to see this. The next few missions paint more of a story. One called The Strand gives a clear picture of the world, the political situation, the way people are acting and reacting. Sardonically named newspapers you have to zoom up into to read, with titles like Old Colonial News and Old English News talk about the vacation the Prime Minister has gone on, containing jingoistic slogans like "Nuke 'em all, drive 'em out." There are people dancing in the night, enjoying themselves. Bright neon surrounded by graffiti. I assume they're all drunk, but that's projection on my part. I know I've never danced like that sober. The level after that plunges you into darkness, and you see the scale of what is being fought. Tentacles the size of train cars laying uselessly around as lightning and guns flash. Horrific monsters encroaching from the sea, emerging and flailing and fighting. You take your photographs and wonder what you could have done to help the soldiers. Not like you could, of course. They didn't even take notice of you wandering through the battlefield. From there, you are a refugee fleeing. You are on a train riding away from ruins. You are hiding. You are scampering. The threat is immense. It is immovable. In the last level of the game, lets you take one final photo as the spirits of the dead stand beside you, and you can take one last image of a great beast staring down the world. And the game ends dedicated to the last generation that needs to watch the world die. I don't really know how to explain this game without really talking about the real-world context it is situated within. It was created out of a lot of aesthetic and cultural influences, but the two that I want to focus on are the dual crises of COVID-19 and climate change. Specifically cited by the creator has been the Australian bushfires that occurred in apocalyptic spectacle. And, the inability to respond to COVID-19 solidifies the feeling at the core of Umurangi generation. In the words of the creator, it was a here we go again moment. How quickly did advertisements start with "in this difficult time"? How quickly did people try to make governmental policy fall in line with capitalism? Arguments about reopening raged before vaccines were ever approved. To say nothing of the impending inequality between nations when it comes to vaccinations. It's a crisis measured in months, not seconds, slowly grinding and revealing every structural inequality and sick thing about this world. The apocalypse in Umurangi Generation 2 is not a single moment. It was ongoing, presumably for months, if not years, before the game started. And even the dramatic moments you see are just flare-ups, not the crisis itself. Newspapers urge more bombing runs, more violence, tell us that the Prime Minister has gone away on a lovely vacation. That was something that brought a particular dull, cold anger to me. It reminded me of my own Prime Minister taking a family trip for Easter during the pandemic when we were all supposed to lock down. But that is all minor, incalculably insignificant to the human cost. Millions dead, corruption exposed on every level. Yet those in power seem immune to the rules of the real world, as the Prime Minister of Umurangi Generation seems to be, flying off in the midst of an alien invasion to vacation. It feels impossible, really, schlocky, like a joke in a Mars Attack style movie, but I can't bring myself to say that it's impossible. With the abdication of responsibility we see in the real world, it feels crystalline and real now. Climate change is, forgive the expression, a hot topic right now. A small town in British Columbia was, in the recent heatwave, essentially wiped off the map. Hundreds died in a heat dome, preventable tragedies from increasingly common freak weather, and mass ecosystem disruption occurred as animals baked in their shell. Deforestation, desertification, we've heard it all. How about this? How many years have been called the hottest on record in your lifetime? At least 2, maybe 3? You might expect me now to go into a spiel about how the game is wrong, how it presents a hopeless, doomeristic view of the world to reject. But I'm not going to do that, because Umurangi Generation understands the feeling of being adrift in crisis, seeing the sick problems of the world and being unable to do anything about them, watching everything go to shit and knowing you can't really help. Posters advertise movies about the ongoing crisis, commodified and made back into entertainment to be sold to the suffering. Graffiti speaks to the frustrations of a tired population, always working and ready to break down. In a most Muskian fashion, advertisements encourage you to fly away into space to escape the problems of the world. This is not a made-by-committee, paint-by-the-numbers story of nihilism. It's born out of the angry, frustrated grievances of someone who knows perfectly well who suffers most in crisis. Climate grief, anxiety around COVID-19, people who feel there's less and less of a future as economic strife hovers overhead. None of that is solved just through platitudes. The forces in the world, the viruses that lurk waiting for zoonotic transmission, the climate that shifts and changes around us, these are problems too big for most of us to understand. There's a reason people spend lifetimes trying to understand epidemiology and ecology. These problems may as well be giant tentacles waving at us from the dark, aliens that come to Earth to try to wipe us all out. Aliens might even be easier to understand. COVID-19 and the climate exist on timescales and in forms we don't register the same way as an immediate, blunt threat most of the time. People tend to think of crisis as something sudden, something that happens and then is over and we can get to work on. An earthquake, a fire, a single destructive event. But that's not really how they work, and Umurangi Generation understands that. It understands that those dramatic, singular event crises are never the whole story. The crisis of climate change started ages ago when moths first changed color to better hide from predators, and London was consumed in pea soup fogs that choked the residents out. COVID-19 has taken grinding, terrible months, and now the impoverished nations of the world are struggling to be vaccinated while the wealthy hoard and hoard. And you can start to see links between deforestation and zoonotic transmission, between mass unsustainable agricultural practices and environmental crisis, between politicians who listen to lobbyists and corporations more than people. They become tentacles of a monster that becomes impossible to view in full. Umurangi Generation is a angry, bitter, horrifying story that understands exactly what makes people angry, bitter, and horrified. That many problems of the past, of modernity, of the world, of the future are not heroic stories where people can stand up and fight and a plucky rebel swoops in and saves the day, but it's often a slow, grinding, painful process we feel utterly lost in. And what I appreciate is your role in this game, a photographer who isn't there to help the world, save it from itself. You're there to watch, observe, see the tiny details, every small act of frustrated resistance, every lashing out by a sick, tired populace, every tiny joy people try to derive from it all. And fundamentally, thanks to its design and its philosophy, what it gives you is a chance to record apocalypse and put your own personal spin on it, to force a perceptiveness on you and make you examine everything in detail, to pick apart, move, and angle yourself, position people to make the world yours. It's a small thing, yeah, but it feels so important. It's an act, a tiny piece of control you can cling to in the storm. There's a lot to talk about this game that I'm not even touching on. It takes at most an hour and a half to play through, but it is such a layered experience that you can't play it without having part of yourself reflected back at you, what you choose to focus on, what you choose to ignore, how you try to make art in the crisis, and what your response to the dioramas it presents are. I don't really have a hopeful way to end this video. I don't think I could write one that was fair, that didn't fundamentally seem dishonest. Because I don't play Umurangi Generation to feel hopeful. I play it to process my hopelessness. To have a space that seems to understand so intimately the nature of crisis, the feeling of ennui and horror and low-level base anxiety that consumes me and so many people in my generation. It's a space bounded in a few hundred megabytes on my hard drive that I can boot up and think about and observe a world in crisis. It's not there to blot out emotion, it's not a distraction, it's a companion, a piece of art that speaks to me, to my fears, my anxieties, when crisis is measured in months and the world is steeped in confusion and fear, when every day there's a new looming threat that's connected to every other looming threat. Umurangi Generation stands out as a game that gets it and refuses to sugarcoat it. And for that, I love it. Like, comment, subscribe if you liked the video. It wasn't a happy one, I know. I could talk about this game for hours, but I cut my script to one specific thing that stood out to me, to stay on message and to keep it short. I'll post some more thoughts of mine in the pinned comment. Also, my channel got quite recently demonetized because of some videos I had laying around on this channel from before it was ever a media channel. So if you want to join the lovely people scrolling by, I would really appreciate it. I want to thank my $10 patron Patrick, my $5 patrons Alicia Escobar and Rita Audrey Jones, and all my patrons and subscribers, really. They help support me directly, and I appreciate all of them.